Thank you so much for joining us for a discussion on the conflicts and synergies between poverty alleviation and climate change mitigation. This is the fourth in a series, the Yale Development Dialogues, Economic Policy Lessons from History. I'm Catherine Cheney, and I'll be your moderator today. So poverty reduction and environmental protection are often seen as conflicting goals, but the climate crisis is forcing many of us to rethink economic growth. So the question we'll be asking today is, what might that look like? What are green pathways out of poverty? And how might we redefine international development in a way that does not present climate progress and human progress as incompatible? Joining us to discuss this topic, I'm thrilled to welcome Sunil Amrith, the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History at Yale and current chair of the South Asian Studies Council. His research focuses on histories of environment, migration, and public health across South and Southeast Asia. Julie Livingston is Silver Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History at New York University and author of Self-Devouring Growth, a planetary parable as told from Southern Africa, which you'll hear more about. Her work is at the intersection of history, anthropology, and public health. Rory Stewart is a senior fellow at the Yale Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, where he focuses on contemporary politics and in crisis and on international development and intervention in fragile and conflict-affected states. And very relevant to today's conversation, Stewart also served as the UK Secretary of State for International Development, where he doubled the UK's investment in international climate and environment and faced some challenges in doing so, which I know I'm looking forward to hearing more about. And finally, Rohini Pande is the Henry J. Hines II Professor of Economics and Director of the Economic Growth Center at Yale. Her work focuses on testing innovative ways to make the state more accountable to its citizens, such as strengthening women's economic and political opportunities, ensuring that environmental regulations reduce harmful emissions, and providing citizens effective means to voice their demands for state services. So I'd love to open this conversation with Sunil. And Sunil, you really championed this topic as one we should feature in the Yale Development Dialogue. So I wonder if you can kind of set the scene for us. What does it look like, and what are some of the challenges in terms of this perceived trade-off? And can you take us through some of the history of environmental protection and development being seen as a trade-off?
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks everyone for joining us. This was really brought home to me just last month when we had the collapse or partial collapse of two dams in Uttarakhand in northern India. Many people were killed, most of them workers on the site. And I was struck that for more than a decade, environmentalists and the courts have been warning that that sort of infrastructural development in such an ecologically fragile region is reckless, that a catastrophe like this was almost inevitable. And yet these projects plowed on. And one of the first responses to the disaster by the Chief Minister of Uttarakhand was to very quickly point out that we shouldn't let what has happened lead people to adopt an anti-development narrative. And that really gave me pause, because I realized in a sense how pervasive that view is. The idea that environmental concern is anti-development. And as a historian, I'm very curious and concerned with where that pattern of thinking came from. And I'd like to maybe just give you two or three examples, because I think we need to go back to the 1960s, 1970s to really understand it. The first example is Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. Carson is rightly celebrated, I think, as a scientific hero of the 20th century. We all owe a huge amount to her courage and her intelligence. But at the time, many in the development community felt like the rug had been pulled from under them. And the link, of course, was DDT. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was one among a few factors that led the US government to withdraw its massive funding for the WHO's malaria eradication program and to divert a lot of that to population control. Now, the WHO's program was already in trouble by the early 1960s. There was a lot of evidence of insecticide resistance, but still there was a feeling that this transformative life-saving technology had been taken away. I'll give you a second example from about a decade later, in the early 1970s, the Club of Rome's report, The Limits to Growth. And in many ways, that is a forerunner of so many of the debates we're having now about growth and the environment. But one of the main concerns of the Club of Rome's report was with population growth in poor countries. And immediately the response from a lot of poorer countries was that the problem is not population growth, the problem is inequality and overconsumption. And I think that one of the most forceful statements of that view comes from India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who's one of the few heads of state to attend the first UN conference on the global environment in Stockholm in 1972. And her speech there, I think, still has quite a lot of moral power to it, because the first thing she did was to acknowledge environmental crisis. But the second thing she did was to say that it has to wait for poverty reduction. That poverty, and her famous line from that speech is not poverty the greatest polluter. And she added that the poorest countries, and perhaps the poorest people within those countries, suffered from problems that they were perhaps least responsible for causing. Finally, I think through the 80s and 90s, you see a backlash against animal conservation projects that tended to treat local people, often very marginalized people, indigenous people, as the enemy. I think we need to understand this history. I think we need to recognize the moral force behind some of these arguments in order perhaps to move beyond them. For the simple reason that I think that today, and certainly in the medium term, climate change and a whole range of other environmental crises present perhaps the most serious obstacle of all to poverty reduction and to large numbers of people being able to live lives of dignity.
Thank you, Sunil. And I think that's a powerful articulation for the importance of these conversations, needing to understand this history in order to tackle these challenges. And Julie, I see you nodding your head. It seems like you've come across many of these dynamics in your research on the African continent, and specifically in Botswana, which I know is a focus of your book. So can you tell us a little bit more about what I know you've described as the consequences of a growth at all costs model, and what lessons we might learn from Botswana?
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. You know, Botswana, for several decades after its independence from Great Britain, had one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It's had a really well-managed development trajectory. The standard of living has risen. There are important social welfare programs, a functioning public health system, participatory democracy, and yet climate change is helping us realize that even in a best case development scenario, which most places cannot realize, it's not sustainable. There needs to be a radically different thinking about how this is going to work. Botswana is currently mining its groundwater. Aspects of climate change are contributing to desertification. This is a place that had been a carbon sink, and yet nonetheless is going through a really drastic kind of terraforming that threatens its long-term well-being. And I think that that raises all kinds of questions. First of all, we have to recognize that carbon is important, but it's not the only problem. We have a whole set of interlinked problems: toxicity and pollution, the problem of waste, loss of biodiversity, topsoil erosion, and they fit together into a web that is synergistic and extremely threatening, particularly to people who are already living in poverty. When you start looking at it closely, what you realize is that you can't really separate the problem into that of nation states in the way that development usually functions. Botswana doesn't have the ability to control its own climate. It's not the major producer of carbon in the world, even though it is connected in a global system of consumption and trade that is ultimately reshaping its climate. Really, most of the energy of this is coming from the global north. So where, as development asks us to look at the problem of poverty by looking closely at southern countries, I really think, as many activists in the South have long said, that the problem is in the North. This is where the majority of consumption and greenhouse gas emission is coming from. We are the people who set the terms of global trade. You know, if we were to just close the tax havens and relocalize wealth back to the South where it is being generated and extracted from, already we would be doing something that enables poverty reduction without it being premised necessarily on a growth model. So there are a number of examples we could give, but I think development, unfortunately, is constitutive of the problem. It's not something that's going to be able to be moderated by small technical fixes or a slight recalibration.
Powerful points. So when we talk about how do we redefine development, these aren't small changes. This is an entire transformation of the system that's needed. So I want to go to Rory now, and Julie, will come back to you. But Rory, I know some of these dynamics came into play when you were leading DFID, when you tried to make the case for environmental conservation work, for climate change action. It was perceived as in conflict with some of the development work. So can you take us through the challenges you faced and how you ultimately pushed through some of those?
Well, thank you, Catherine, very much. I think the first thing is I came in to become the Secretary of State to run DFID at a moment where the DFID budget was big. It was about 0.7% of UK GDP, so spending about $20 billion a year. And approximately half of that was being spent in Africa. And it was a time when there was an increasing consensus that we should try to tackle an environmental and climate crisis alongside poverty. So there were World Bank reports and OECD reports suggesting that if we didn't manage to deal with problems of climate and environment, we would end up with hundreds of millions more people in poverty. But when I actually began to try to shift the organization to focus more on these issues, I discovered there was an enormous amount of resistance. And some of that, of course, Sunil has demonstrated has a very long history. So clearly what I was encountering with civil servants were memories of these debates which had been going on for many, many decades. Part of it was, as Sunil has pointed to, an instinctive suspicion of projects to do with non-humans. That's a very important thing, that generally speaking, when we talk about development, we're talking about humans. And people find it uncomfortable being made to talk about animals or even about plants and habitats. I think that's the first thing. And that also goes simply to the way that we measure things. All the targets in DFID, all the metrics were arranged around 100 million girls getting education or X 100 million people being taken out of poverty. The second thing was the way that economists measured things, and a very strong sense from the development economists in DFID that by allocating money to climate efficiently, and this was not the most effective way of maximizing the number of people we were going to take out of poverty. Now, there are many questions around those kinds of models. Could we really take people out of poverty in the mechanistic way that they imagined? How did these models work? Nevertheless, that was the way in which they saw the world, and those were the sort of suspicions that people had. And I think the final thing, and then I'll hand back to people, is that it's important to understand that institutions develop programs over 20, 30 years. They invest in certain kinds of things, which are very difficult for them to get out of. So the Commonwealth Development Corporation would end up having owning a third of the electricity generation of Tanzania. And that would be carbon-based electricity generation, difficult to extract from. We just given another $4 billion to the Commonwealth Development Corporation, and it wanted to make more lending on energy. And most of the clients that it found were carbon-based energy producers. We were giving money through development banks, World Bank, African Development Bank, which were funding projects with heavy oil generation in Senegal. And it was extremely, if I said, no, we're stopping all this, the general response from civil servants is, well, could we avoid stopping it immediately? Could we have a glide path? Could we just sign off on this heavy oil plant? And maybe in 3-4 years' time, we can move out of this. We need a long-term strategic vision. Some of that was genuine. Some of that, of course, is a hope that the Secretary of State will be reshuffled before they have to actually shift the way in which the program balance works. I'm going to stop on that. I mean, there are many, many rich themes that we can return to here, but I think it's just, it was a surprise to me to understand that something that seemed so straightforward and oddly was very popular with the British public. There was no real resistance from the British public that international development money could be used for climate and environment. In fact, it was one of the easiest ways of defending the 0.7%, is to say to people, this is our contribution to the fight on global climate change. But the resistance from within the organization was surprisingly strong, enough for me.
Thank you, Rory. And you're right, it's something that seems so straightforward, and yet actually implementing policies that acknowledge the complexity we're discussing today is easier said than done. And so that brings me to Rohini. Rohini, I'm curious whether you can help us connect this conversation, not only the topic, but the urgency of the topic, to some of the conversations happening right now in development economics.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And I'm very happy to be here. I think let me start by saying what I'm not going to talk about, which is, I think a very common response right now to think about these issues is to invoke the idea of degrowth, is to say that, we've had enough of economic growth, what we need to move towards a world where we focus on not growing more. And I think what Rory said really brings up this idea that no matter what your objective is, the issue is really, do you have the policy levers to get there? So I think just moving a conversation from saying, growth is bad for the climate, let's move to degrowth, is not going to be very helpful because we don't actually know how to do degrowth any better necessarily than how we know how to do growth in the poorest parts of the world that probably still need it. So when we come to then the issue of thinking about how do we actually think of policies for climate change, I do think the issue that comes up, a lot of it has to do with political economy. And that both has to do with, if you think about who's affected by climate change, but also I think the difference in doing policies for mitigation versus those for adaptation. So, going back to what Rory was talking about, development agencies, I remember having a fascinating session with someone at one of the new large investment banks, AIIB in China, who was describing that they wanted to lend for environmental purposes. They wanted to lend for ways of mitigation in a city, but it was very hard to get all the stakeholders to agree. So if you wanted to change, for instance, how urban energy system worked, you had to go and get 5 different constituents on. What was much easier to do was after a crisis that happened to go and say, let's build a seawall, or to go and say, after, say, as Sunil said, the Uttarakhand crisis happens, to go and say, we need to provide those who've been rendered homeless new homes. And I think that's one of the issues we face is really, if we want to address climate change carefully and alongside therefore affect economic development, we need to be thinking a lot about mitigation. But it's hard to do because the people who are affected the most ex ante, they are also the ones with the least power. And so in a society with a lot of inequality, it's going to be very hard to persuade those who are doing well today to look out for not themselves, but those who are going to be possibly rendered homeless by climate change tomorrow. So let me keep that as my starting comments here, Catherine.
Thank you, appreciate it. And I do want to go ahead and welcome questions from our audience. I know we have a very engaged audience and I'm always excited to read your questions. So I have a few questions for the group, but if you're joining us on Zoom, please go ahead and submit any questions you have in the Q&A box. But I want to zoom in on something Rohini was just mentioning in terms of inequality. And in line with our goals to connect history and practice, I'd actually love to start with you, Sunil, and then hear from others. What does history teach us about the unequal impacts of environmental degradation? And how could this lens of inequality help inform our conversation around poverty alleviation and climate change mitigation and finding those synergies?
I think the lens of inequality may well be the key to sort of taking this conversation in a different direction, because I think we have plenty of historical evidence on any time scale you want to think through, whether it's several hundred years or the last 50 years, suggesting that, in fact, environmental threats, environmental risks fall most heavily on the poorest and most marginalized people. they haven't been recognized as such perhaps until recently. And I mean, I think that's one of the historical trajectories that I've found interesting. The fact that this was not necessarily visible in the heyday of state-directed development in the 1960s, 1970s. And yet I think that is a place where we can have a slightly different kind of conversation, not so much about whether we are for growth or degrowth, but how addressing inequality as just a constitutive part, as Julie was saying, of the problem writ large, including the problem of climate change, but not limited to it. I just also want to pick up on what Julie was saying about this is not just about carbon. I think we do need to make sure that we're having this conversation in a way that recognizes that at different scales, in different kinds of environmental crisis, are supercharging existing patterns of inequality.
And on that point that it's not just about carbon, Julie, I know your background includes public health, and I wonder if you can speak a little bit to, when we talk about the unequal impacts of climate change, this is not just in the future, this is very much now. So can you tell us a little bit more about, I know sometimes you describe this in terms of the upstream and the downstream and where development tends to be geared. So one, what do you think about inequality as maybe a useful lens, a useful way to reframe the conversation? And two, from your background, not just your research, but also your work in public health, how do you connect that with this conversation?
Sure. I think that downstream, there are, pressing and immediate concerns like those that Rohini has been gesturing toward. Absolutely. When people need to eat, they need to eat. When their homes are flooded, they need remediation. But upstream, if we don't turn off the tap that is creating this problem, inequality grows and the need for remediation just grows. And that is becoming evident in our day-to-day. So when you think upstream in public health, you realize that, for example, in Africa where I work, what until recently was a predominantly rural and agricultural continent has been urbanizing rapidly. There are people who are getting on tiny, unseaworthy boats in order to try to reach a place where they will be able to feed their families. And way upstream at the back of that are a whole complicated welter of relationships. And one of them are changes in land use and land access patterns and the ongoing enclosure of the commons that is pushing people off of their land, and also the effects of climate change that are making it so they can no longer make a go of it as a fisherman or as farmers, etc. If we think in terms of the pandemic, we know that the evisceration of wild lands is hemming in wild species in ways that are facilitating zoonosis. We've seen that with Ebola. Now we see it again with COVID. So I do think, of course, that mitigation at the coalface needs to happen, but I am a degrowth proponent. I don't see any other way. I don't think we can keep creating the problem and then trying to mitigate it. There are people who fall through the cracks continually when that happens.
I wanted to ask Rory a question because Rory, we heard some of the challenges you faced within DFID. And I wonder, as Julie just mentioned, public awareness of some of the very immediate problems with the damage humans are doing to the planet. Public awareness is growing. I mean, COVID-19 and zoonotic disease is one clear example of how environmental destruction is having very immediate human impacts. Do you think it would be different if you were leading DFID, now FCDO, if you were leading the UK's aid portfolio right now? Could you make a different argument? Could you build on that momentum? And can other leaders do the same at this moment?
I think you can, but it's worth bearing in mind that it's still unfortunately true that most polling in most developed countries puts environment surprisingly low down on voters' priorities, and the amount that they're prepared to spend on it is still very limited. I discovered this, for example, running to be mayor of London, when I was trying to emphasize even issues which you would have thought would really matter to people, like air quality, let alone things like planting trees. I mean, it turned out consistently that the campaign managers, the polling advisors would say, Rory, just stop talking about that. People want to talk about knife crime. And they would show data, incredible amount of data to show that people were not prepared to spend even, £50 a month to try to contribute towards these issues. So I think that's an important background. On the specific question of whether you can shift people within development budgets, yes, you can, but remember that that's partly because in the UK, so long as we had the 0.7% target, the voters subconsciously felt, okay, that money is already going to be spent on this kind of stuff anyway. So that the question I'm not being asked is not, would I rather that money was spent on healthcare in Britain or a road in Britain or a school in Britain? This money's got to be spent abroad. And therefore, would I be happy that it was spent on environment and climate work, or would I rather it was spent on some other thing? And frame like that, it was very easy to make the argument for environment and climate work with the public. The problem, though, just to sort of cycle back to some of the issues that different people have been talking about, I think there's the big problem which Julie's raised, which is that it's almost impossible to get a political constituency behind questioning growth itself in most developed countries. It's very, very, very difficult. Even the Green Party in Britain struggles to actually make those kinds of arguments. But I think the other thing is that there is a real problem evaluating the quality of environmental projects on the ground and what their impact is likely to be. So, for example, if you were doing flood management now, it would be very tempting to talk about natural solutions to flood management. So planting trees, for example, to stop water movement. But explaining clearly that actually our modeling on this is extremely complicated, that it matters a lot if you're trying to block flooding with trees, what season it is, whether there are leaves on the trees, how old the trees are, that actually that type of management works better when the trees are 20 years old and when they've just been planted, and what all that means for somebody downstream who might be flooded next year, and where the choice is being made not to build a flood wall, but instead to plant some trees that are going to have some impact in 20 years' time. Those are difficult. I think it's also true when we make arguments on organic farming. Again, many of them are great enthusiasts for organic farming, but when it actually comes to explaining to a farmer in Zambia what that's really going to mean in terms of the yield from a hectare of crops, things become much more complicated. We don't really have good natural capital measures in place. And the final thing I wanted to say is that, again, this is quite granular, but it is very striking how incredibly expensive a lot of current proposals on habitat restoration are. I was the environment minister in Britain before I was the international development minister. We were doing peatland restoration projects, restoring peatland, where we would be spending £40 million on reseeding a couple of thousand hectares of peatland by dropping sphagnum moss from helicopters. Right? They've just announced another £400 million project of this sort in Britain. And you can absolutely understand, I'm now going to defend my DFID economists, why they might stick their hands up and say, what, really? Is that the very best thing that you can think to do with your money? Can you really demonstrate the consequence of that? So I suppose what I'm talking about is bridging the gap between Sunil's absolutely correct point that as a general statement, the most marginalized, poorest communities suffer most from recession. That needs to be linked to the very specific question of, are you prepared to spend £400 million on peatland restoration by dropping sphagnum moss from helicopters? Or is there something else you want to do with your money? And we're surprisingly bad at answering those questions.
I want to bring in some questions from the audience here, and one of them has to do with growth. And I feel like we might have some differing opinions among our panelists on the way forward here, which I think it's always interesting to engage in some productive debate. This question is posed to Julie, but I'd love to hear Rohini on this as well, and anyone else who wants to jump in. But Sanjeev Kumar asks Julie, what would it take to convince the skeptics of the degrowth idea to change their minds? Rory just noted that that's very hard to do. And I know you believe that's the only way forward. So what does it take to bring others on board with you?
Thanks, and thanks for that question. I actually think that the public is on board with a number of degrowth strategies already, like the basic income grant, something that has turned out to be quite popular here in the United States, of all places. which is definitely a degrowth strategy, and something that in the US we were always told you can't have. And then after the pandemic, it turned out suddenly for a few months there, we had a basic income grant. I think the closing of tax havens is quite popular among the non-Davos set. Most of us are deeply offended that some people pay and many people really don't, particularly those with a lot of money or corporations that have places to hide it. I think having standards against producing goods that are meant to become obsolete and disposable within a year or two and be replaced would be quite popular among many people. So I think that there are a number of degrowth strategies out there that are already popular. And then you can look around the world at different countries that are taking on degrowth platforms as part of their policy making, whether it's the government of Bolivia or Ecuador, or whether it's New Zealand, which has unhitched its the drivers of its policy from a growth metric. So I think it's, you know, it's a debate, and it's a debate that many people are ready to have. And the more that we unpack it and start talking it through and realize that degrowth is not the same thing as just letting the economy crash out, that in fact it's a very planned and stepwise move into economic systems that are more fair, more just, and that it will not lead us off a precipice. I think people are rational and they're empirical, and they will get behind it.
What do you think, Rohini? I know you began your conversation mentioning degrowth and actually that you wouldn't be advocating for it, but as we unpack it, how would you respond?
Yeah. So I think it's useful to distinguish between degrowth within an economy or within a local area and the question of what it means in terms of global redistribution. And I think this would go back to a lot of the debates that we've been seeing in the aid world in development, is that as even richer are becoming more unequal, it's harder very often to have a case both of saying, let's not just have, say, degrowth within the US or in New Zealand, but let's also send money and resources to Botswana or to other parts of the world. I think the combination of the two is hard, but if we really want to affect climate change, we have to be thinking about the global stage. I mean, I think that's one of the big differences within, say, COVID, where people have recognized that their health depends on others, but they still see it as a very domestic issue. I think everything, for instance, we are seeing right now on vaccine nationalism is very much, I want my neighborhood vaccinated, but it doesn't really ring true for people to think that, you know, vaccination in Ghana is necessary for me to be protected. So I think similarly, when we talk about degrowth, and this is, I think, where Sunil started from, you're going to get very little constituents in favor of degrowth in, say, Sierra Leone or in the poorest parts of India, where you still believe there are a lot of very poor people. So if you have to take degrowth seriously at a level that's going to affect climate change, we have to ask, how are we going to accompany single individuals or single cities in the rich North being happy to degrow, recognizing the type of redistribution that's going to be needed. And I think that requires global coordination. And that's why I think my push has been a lot more, let's talk about the policies we need to, you know, achieve those outcomes. And maybe degrowth will be part of it for the rich economy, but it's certainly not going to be enough on its own.
Here's one more question related to growth. I see Rory wanted to come in. So Rory, maybe you can respond to this question as well. Jacob Rink asking about this growth, degrowth conversation asks, when we speak about growth or degrowth, does it make sense to differentiate between resource and carbon intensive growth and growth in services such as education and health? And I think we would agree to that, or I see nodding heads.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense to make all these distinctions. I mean, this is a very, very difficult thing to resolve, this question of how much willingness there is behind this. And Julie may well be vindicated. I mean, it may well be that in 40 or 50 years' time, she'll turn out to be right. It's very difficult to prove. Generally, people who are campaigning for this kind of thing will tend to be on the optimistic side, and generally working politicians like me will tend to be on the somewhat cynical, pessimistic side about the ability to inspire populations to do things that hit their pocketbooks. It's so, one of the interesting things about politics and change is that these things are so unpredictable. I mean, we clearly can feel this in relation to civil rights. We can feel this in relation to many other changes that we've seen in the 20th century. So it may be that this will shift. I just say that it would be difficult to find many working politicians and major political parties in Europe or the United States that would really imagine selling something as ambitious as Julie's speaking about. That's not to say that it won't happen, but it's going to be a hell of a fight if we're really going to get anywhere close to that.
Agreed.
We're talking about much, much more incremental.
Sorry about that, Rory. Sunil, did I see that you wanted to jump in on this question? No. We have another question coming in that I'd love to ask you all about. So one of the themes that came up in our conversation is, who's responsible to take action, right? And that developed countries, it's often argued that the countries that got us into this climate mess should be at the forefront of getting us out of it, right? So when it comes to what that looks like, there's a question along the lines of a recent Biden, here, let me find this question. Where did it go? There's a question around the Biden administration setting the social cost of carbon to $51 a ton. This attendee, anonymous, asks, this is still significantly lower than many other social cost of carbon values. What is the panel's view of the efficacy of social cost of carbon in mitigating risks to the populations being discussed? And maybe I'll broaden that question. Any panelists who want to comment on the social cost of carbon specifically, interested to hear your views. But more broadly, I will say we should talk perhaps about the US as a leader here. We have a new administration, new policies being rolled out for climate. Might that be an opportunity to harness some of the synergies we're discussing right now, to change the conversation around climate and development? Since this question was posed about the Biden administration, would love to hear any thoughts on that opportunity.
Well, let me come in very quickly and then hand over to others. I mean, I would have thought one thing is just to remind the US that there's an enormous amount that they can do just to catch up, even with, offenders like the United Kingdom. I mean, the UK is hardly a paragon of virtue. It's not New Zealand, right? But it's managed to significantly reduce its electricity consumption. It's managed to move to a situation where 40% of our generation at the moment comes from renewables. And it's done it relatively quickly and relatively painlessly. And the US hasn't even begun to stretch its muscles to match the standards set by major European countries.
Thank you.
I think, sorry. The reality is that the status quo is extremely expensive, right? A year ago, like a tenth, I'm making up this figure, of Australia was on fire. Every year now, a huge part of California, which is a major driver of our economy, is on fire. Look at what just happened in Texas. And before that, what happened in Louisiana and what will happen later in the next place, This is just extraordinarily expensive. But that money doesn't disappear from the economy. People make bank off of this. People are making bank off of this pandemic. And if we don't start to think about relationships as relationships, but instead as siloed events, I think we are misapprehending some of the drivers of our current predicament, including and perhaps especially here in the United States.
Thanks, Julie. And Rohini, I know you wanted to jump in as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to, actually, Julie's comments are a really useful way for me to jump in, which is, one way that economists respond to this, and perhaps the social cost of carbon epitomizes it, is to believe that if we accept this as the cost, we're going to accept higher prices. And so, for instance, thinking about carbon pricing or, cap and trade systems is very popular with economists very often for saying, just let the markets enter and resolve it. And I think, as Julie pointed out, the Texas example is actually an example where you were trying to get the markets to work well, and they didn't. And it's good to remember why, even if you might have a higher cost of carbon, you don't want to rely just on markets. So I think there are a couple of reasons for this. So the first is pricing is sometimes for consumers much more sensitive in some sectors than in others. So for instance, gasoline, politicians don't want to raise the prices on gasoline. So having kind of carbon taxes that are going to translate into the gasoline sector is going to be much harder than trying to introduce carbon pricing in maybe electricity or someplace where it's a much more, if you want, hidden. And so I think pushing on just one instrument can often defeat the purpose, because you may just want to play off the fact that consumers care differently about the marginal cost of different goods. And then the second thing, which I think comes from the Texas example, is I think what we saw is that, yes, prices were able to adjust quite fast, but the investment need to make for these one-off possible, frigid weather in Texas may be seen as so rare that the person who's building the pipe is just not going to invest in that because it's not worth their while. They're not getting a huge return when the energy price goes sky high. So the energy provider gets it, but not the person who's maintaining the pipes. And so again, I think this comes to the issue of the system, that if you want to rely on markets and pricing, we have to realize that there are a lot of players we have to take along. And that will often bring us to much blunter regulation. And so I think it's good if you increase the social cost of carbon, but I think the danger is to then think that the markets will take care of it. I think that just doesn't happen.
So we had a question on social cost of carbon, which we addressed, but we have so many great questions coming in, so keep them coming. I want to group together three questions that also relate to responses while we're talking about responses and responses by different actors. So we have one question around the role of development finance institutions. So the question is, any thoughts on current efforts by DFIs and international organizations on engaging with IFIs, insurers and asset managers, to improve environment-related controls and policies, exiting coal, for instance? So that's one question. I'm going to throw three out, and then we'll see how we can talk around these questions as a panel. There's another question around the role of the private sector. How do you incentivize the private sector to create green economy jobs that also alleviate poverty? London Stock Exchange has created a category called the Green Economy Mark to attract issuers, for example. And now we move into the policy realm. To what extent can environment strategies be combined into development policies to create new jobs that would advance both goals at the same time? So related questions around the role of development finance institutions, the private sector, and policies, combining environment and development policies, something Rory touched on earlier. But all of this has to do with how we respond and how different sectors respond. So any thoughts on any of those questions? I'll see which of our panelists wants to jump in. Rory?
Well, let me firstly say that the overall theory behind those questions has to be right. I mean, there's far more money sitting around in these great financial centers than there are in the development agencies. And if there were some intelligent mechanism for working out how you unlocked the money that was in New York or the City of London and directed it towards the kind of projects we want to do on environment, climate, or on poverty alleviation, that would be a very smart thing to do. My role seems to be in this, though, then saying that in practice, of course, this turns out to be unbelievably difficult, right? I mean, I spend a lot of time crashing around the City of London, trying to work with the insurance industry, trying to work with different forms of an investment fund, trying to define green investment funds. And the amount of money in the end that we actually got available to be invested was surprisingly limited. Because there seems to be fundamentally a problem, generally speaking, which is that these things are not as profitable as we want to pretend. There is a reason why, generally speaking, effectively public grant money is more likely to be able to go into some of these sectors than private capital. And it's a lesson we learn in 100 different ways. I mean, one of the most depressing things about development in Africa is that it's very easy to make a presentation about the extraordinary potential of Africa, the incredible human capital, the incredible natural capital, a great story about how this is the future. And you make those presentations again and again while being aware that British Airways is shutting all its flights into Africa, the major hedge funds are drawing out of Africa, Barclays Bank is getting rid of all its branches in Africa. So there is a problem that we keep returning to, which is that the theory of this has to be right, but nobody has yet managed to crack this at scale.
Thank you, Rory. Any other thoughts on those questions? Otherwise, we have plenty more coming in. I'm thrilled with our engagement here. I want to go to this question from again Sanjeev Kumar here, and I think it's very well put. And I wonder if this is something Sunil might speak to. Sanjeev asks, my sense is that the philosophical foundation undergirding the work of researchers and policymakers is too narrow to empathize with the pain the current course of development and growth is inflicting on people. Do you think that we need a deep reevaluation of the way we build knowledge about the world?
That is beautifully put. And I think, in fact, sort of epitomizes some of the what we're grappling with now, because in a sense, there have long been multiple ways of knowing the world, fully capable of comprehending the pain that some of the current paths of development have inflicted on people around the world. Those are not the kinds of knowledge that have tended to be valued or influential within the development sector or within a lot of policy making. So that is a gap that I think has widened since the 1980s, where there's a lot of work by anthropologists like James Ferguson and others writing in the late 80s, early 90s. He wrote a wonderful book in 1990 called The Anti-Politics Machine, about the sort of depoliticizing thrust of a lot of development. He's also working in Southern Africa like Julie at the time. And it doesn't seem to me that that debate has really sort of intersected with some of the conversations that are being had within the development sector about metrics, about measuring success, the kinds of points that Rory was making. How does DFID measure success? It may well be that, anthropologists are involved with the World Bank and are being employed by some of the international development agencies. But it's not the same as to say that some of those forms of knowledge have truly sort of started to inform or influence the way in which we think about development. And I mean, I do like very much the way Sanjeev's use of the word pain. And I mean, I think that is important. These are very emotive topics. One only needs to look at the farmers' protests going on in India now. They're sort of enormous, colossal scale to understand that something has gone wrong. In the sense that, Punjab was India's agricultural success story since the Green Revolution. And clearly that masks so much inequality and so much that is now sort of manifesting itself in really a major political movement.
And Sunil, you mentioned the farmers' protests. That brings me to a question from Camille Hassan, who asks about the role of labor. So I think we've talked a lot about, from a policy level, private sector, more top down in some of the framing in terms of actions to be taken. Now I'd love to talk a little bit more about in the grassroots advocacy, bottom up, if you will. Not that I love that framing, but here's the question from Camille Hassan. I'd like to perhaps push onto the urgency of this question the way Sunil began. What is the position of labor in the contemporary moment? And Camille asks about the US, for example, in the midst of a struggle to raise the minimum wage, but how do we engage with labor with regards to the conversation on growth? So any thoughts on that, labor, and then perhaps more broadly, just advocacy and demand from people most affected by where we go from here? I see Julie might want to jump in on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I will say that in Botswana, where I do my research, where you've had this really spectacular economic growth, high unemployment has remained intractable. There is something happening in our global economy, which is the evisceration and the slow disappearance of labor in many ways. And we see that manifest in the kind of political reconfiguration that used to lean on labor as being the political entry point for certain sectors of society. And that's being, heavily impinged on. I'm glad that the person writing the question was pointing to the US, where we see that around the minimum wage, and we see it around tensions over union organizing and essential workers right now. I think that can be generalized globally. And I do think that it is one of the ways that the basic income grant is just incredibly important. Because many people in this world have no choice but to sell their labor at a price value that is absolutely unacceptable, or to turn themselves essentially into a debt peon in order to be able to transit somewhere, to be able to be employed. And that's just, that can't be the solution to poverty or the environment.
I want to throw in, Rory, did you want to jump in on that?
Very quickly, just to very strongly agree with Julie. I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things in many sub-Saharan African countries in particular is the unemployment rates. I mean, around the edges of Dar es Salaam, you've got unemployment rates amongst young people of about 85%. And the population, of course, is growing unbelievably quickly, so that by 2050, it's projected that 1 in 10 children born in the world will be born in Nigeria. But the hope, which is that you could combine capital from the developed world with the labor from rapidly growing places like Africa, just hasn't happened. And indeed, changes in technology, robotics, AI, etc., suggest that it may not happen. And so it's actually very miserable. I mean, I get very sad when I go to Botswana, visiting communities which, as Julie says, theoretically are moving into an upper middle income status, but where everybody is basically is struggling to fill their days.
Well, I would say that I think Botswana's doing pretty well for the majority of the population. But that said, these are economies that are based around extraction. And that is sort of the elephant in the room that we haven't really talked about. They're extractive, and that's meant to provide the employment. And then they purchase, in a global marketplace that doesn't localize production. I don't know. I feel like the WTO is somehow yet another elephant in this room that maybe we haven't addressed.
That's a really interesting point, and it relates to one more question I want to bring in from the audience as we start to wrap up, because it's forward-looking. So this is from, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Marisan Blum, who asks, how can the global north transform the conversation from carbon emissions to inequality, as well as the global north's own history of overconsumption? So I don't know how optimistic we are that can happen, but what would that look like? And how might it happen? Any thoughts from our panelists?
So I think just to link this back to the last question on thinking about labor movements, if we think about this and we think about these kind of broad discussions about the Green New Deal, or the linking of things like, the minimum wage, to saying that we want to think about growth differently, that may be one way forward. My concern does remain that these tend to be quite domestic conversations. And so I think another place to think about, which I feel we started touching about in the last one, but not really, is how climate change and also the lack of kind of good jobs in the developing world is underlying a lot of what we see on the migration trends. So if we think a lot of what's happening on the kind of the coasts of Europe, or from Central America to the US, has its deeper roots in sort of climate change, combined with the, people first go to the urban centers in these countries, there aren't a lot of jobs, then they start thinking what to do next. I think that's perhaps also a way that the world's going to get interlinked, and maybe one at some point will stop having the nasty reaction that we can just keep people out and actually start dealing a little bit more with the root causes. But I think labor is going to be critical to how we link these conversations across rich and poor countries.
Agreed. So we have just 5 minutes left here, and I want to quickly hear from each of you if there's anything we didn't get to in this conversation. I'll throw in one question I had that I'd love any thoughts on, but we'll open it up to see what you might want to add. So I think one thing we weren't able to get into as much as I would like is measurement. So we had a bit of a debate around growth, degrowth, rethinking growth, but that has to do with what metrics we use. And I do think there's growing consensus that economic growth is not the best metric to capture poverty reduction, biodiversity, the well-being of people and the planet, and how interconnected that is. So if this is a moment for a reset, how might we change the way we measure? So that's a question from me, but perhaps panelists have something else they'd like to say. With just a minute each, we'll go around. I'll actually start with Rohini, if that's all right. And maybe we can end with Sunil, where we began. So Rohini, let's start with you. Final thoughts, and perhaps it has to do with measurement or anything else you'd like to note.
Yeah, so I'll start with measurement, but actually a different measurement than the one you talked about, but one about measuring the effects of climate policy. So I still think a case that a lot of the discussions on how climate change policy will happen is being undertaken by lawyers. So a lot of these conversations, happen among kind of it could be COP26 coming up, otherwise it'll be a lot of lawyers talking about what done or what are responsibilities of countries without thinking about implementation or how you would measure it. And I think we repeatedly see a lot of the failures of international climate change policy coming from not thinking about how we measure them. I think a classic example, for instance, is offsets. Offsets have become very popular as a way of thinking about how you would do your little bit for climate change. But how do we know what we're offsetting? Would that action even have happened? I mean, that goes to the heart of what I think, economists measure all the time, which is what was the counterfactual, what was going to happen without the offset. And I think if that room didn't just have lawyers and people sort of thinking about what is acceptable to the private sector, but actually thought about measurement and impacts, maybe on those policies, we would also make a bit more progress. So that's from me.
Thanks, Rohini. Rory, we'll go to you next.
So for me on measurement, I think it's really important to look at a measurement of natural capital, which is very central to the policy debate, certainly in the UK, but actually increasingly elsewhere, in terms of trying to work out how you attach a value to carbon, climate, biodiversity, and people's interactions with natural landscapes. It is unbelievably difficult to get any sort of agreement around it, because small differences in how much value you attribute, for example, to leisure and aesthetic appreciation can completely transform the value you ascribe to a particular landscape. It's very, very difficult to explain to the public. It's something that is in a dangerous situation, because it's something where we have a strong emotional and idealistic attachment to the idea of natural capital measurement, and are therefore suppressing some very good empirical questions about how these models operate and whether they're really effective ways of allocating resources. Getting that right is going to be a very, very important part of determining particularly how governments choose to spend their money, how treasuries assess investment in these kinds of things, both domestically and internationally.
And Julie, thoughts from you on how we measure, or any other closing thoughts you have? Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
You'd think after a year of this, I would have learned about that. I think moving away from GDP as the measurement is really important. As a public health person, I know, for example, that GDP is underneath all kinds of health indicators and how they're modeled. So for example, when GDP goes up, the maternal mortality rate goes down, whether or not there are women dying in labor. So I think it's a blunt measurement that needs to go away. And I am a huge proponent of the work of the development economist Kate Raworth, Raworth, and I recommend you all read her book, Donut Economics, which puts forward a different model of measurement.
Thank you, Julie. I love when I come out of conversations with action items, so I appreciate that. And we'll close with Sunil. Sunil, I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate you being the one to suggest we have it. What are your closing thoughts or any calls to action for this group?
My closing thought's not about measurement. It's that we haven't said anything about China. And I think if we are going to think about the future of growth and degrowth, We probably need to engage with what those might mean in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, in the context of China's ambitions across Eurasia and indeed into Africa. And so I would just sort of end with a call to really take a global perspective on this, perhaps even moving between the global North and the global South in the traditional terms we think about development.
Thank you, Sunil. Perhaps the starting point for a future edition of the Yale Development Dialogues. Well, I want to make sure we end on time. Thank you all so much for the great questions, and we'll make sure to get back to those we didn't have time to answer. Thank you to our panelists, and stay tuned for upcoming editions of the Yale Development Dialogues, where I think, as we've all just seen the value of here, we bring historians and practitioners together to discuss some of these very complicated issues and the way forward. Thank you all.